You're tuned into the Unnecessary Harm podcast, where we drill down on issues of substance use and its cultural impact. Your host, Shane Varcoe, Executive Director of the Deakin Institute, with over 40 years experience in youth and community work and a passion for building resilience.
Hey, welcome back to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Great to have you back with us. And if you're tuning in for the first time, welcome on board, as always, to new listeners. And there's a growing subscriber base as we speak, which is wonderful. Thanks, guys, for subscribing. Today's guest is currently the Professor and Chair in Health Psychology, School of Psychology, at Deakin University. He's the co-leader of SEED, Social and Early Emotional Development Research Centre, which focuses on intervention and life course sciences, and also the director at Communities That Care Limited. He has authored or co-authored, get this, over 400 research papers and scholarly articles. He's referred to them in them. He's part of that process. It's quite remarkable in his long and remarkable academic tenure. He is a previous chair and significant actor in the International Society for Prevention Research, and was awarded the prestigious President's Award in 2023 for his lifetime contribution to prevention science, and that is no small award. Now, that's only the tip of the iceberg, people, of this remarkable guest. And if I read out his 5-page short summary at CV that he has, we'd be here for the next 45 minutes, and that's not going to work. So I'll spare us all that. Professor John Toumbourou, welcome to the Unnecessary Harm podcast.
Great to be here, Shane.
Fantastic. Now, look, the conversation we're going to have today, look, it's been a long time coming. And we've talked back and forth about the possibility of getting you on, and we've had a long and wonderful connection over many years, and sort of it's been the timing of getting you on the program. And it's what I love about the fact is the trigger that got pulled recently is a paper that was published, which we'll talk about that later on. But before we sort of get into that space and talk about paper and academia and the whole area of prevention and alcohol and other drugs and that kind of thing, we'd like to know a little bit more about who you are. I think a lot of people listening to us will know who you are. If not know who you are, I've heard of you. That's a given. But there's going to be many that don't know who you are. So we always like to, with every guest we get on, John, is give a little bit of a drill down into some of their past, nothing too personal, just to kind of connect with, motivations, drivers, that kind of thing. So, you've been on this academic journey for a long, long time. So give us if you can, I don't need specific dates, but how long have you been in this particular academic space? And, when did it all start for you, particularly this whole area of early childhood development and prevention?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been at Deakin University as a professor since 2007. So this particular part of my journey has been one that I've been very honoured and pleased to be on. It's during that time, Deakin University went from being in the bottom third of Australian universities to now being in the top 1% of universities in the world. So we've had this stellar rise that's occurred. And we've been pretty deliberate about trying to sort of foster a university that's on about the greater good, a place where we do try and make sure students have an absolutely wonderful experience. And we value working with partners. So partners such as yourself, Shane, and the good work that you do has been very near and dear to our heart. So that's the sort of place that I've really enjoyed working in. And it's been a perfect match for the way I like to work. So as it relates to our topic of unnecessary harm, during that career, I've been really very interested in the possibility that we could prevent alcohol and drug problems. And so my career trajectory was that in the mid-90s, I completed my PhD, and that was an evaluation of the Odyssey House therapeutic community. So it's a drug-free
It's been around a long time,
community.
isn't it?
Yeah. And that really taught me a lot about just the harm that the addiction to drugs had caused for that group of people who were treated there and their struggles to get free of that addiction, and just the number of them who were unable to and that were still addicted when I followed them up in my studies. And so I really wanted to get to the bottom of what's going on, what sort of reasons do people have for starting to use drugs, and then how can we help them recover? That's been a real feature of what I've been interested in my career. And so I've had the chance to study those using a life course lens through the work we've done at Seed in Deakin. So it's been absolutely a privilege and a wonderful journey.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And the follow-up question to that was about catalysts, and I think you've sort of touched on that, and I want to maybe explore that a little bit more. It's interesting that first PhD paper looking at the outcomes, the other end of this. I know we've argued for a long time as an institute that they're basically there's this kind of two bookends, if you like. There's the pre-drug use and post-drug use, right? And that kind of the uptake, before uptake, and the final exit from. And the idea is that why has that gap got bigger over time, and of the drug using space and not less? And what are the factors that are contributing to that? And I like the catalyst for you, flipping from the other bookend of recovery, which is vital and important, and we celebrate that, and we work with recovery institutions, organisations, and the recovery alumni specifically, because we think they have incredible capacity to add value to the prevention space. But it's that catalyst of, well, you didn't just follow on with the recovery regimen. We didn't follow on with that, although that's part of what you study and what you deploy. But you've gone, you know what? This doesn't have to happen. That's what I'm picking up. It's like, how do we stop this from happening in the first place? So that seemed to be a catalyst for you. Was there anything else prior to that in your life, and without doing too personal, I don't know, that may have been added to that impetus of saying, yeah, I really don't want this to happen to people?
Well, going to that question of what do we learn when we do studies of places like Odyssey House about the origins of the addictions, it was very clear in following the ex-residents up that they had been talking a lot about things that happened in their family, and there'd been larger numbers of them who had difficult experiences. There'd been all sorts of things happening. The families were also a catalyst for them to come into the therapeutic community, so that was very important. The other thing you begin to learn when you look a bit more deeply at the recovery movement is just how much it's been influenced by the sort of spiritual frameworks of the 12-step programs. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk to them about recovery, many of them are aware of that. And so there's various parts of the recovery stories that you see. So at the Odyssey House therapeutic community, they were influenced by that movement towards the self-help movement that came from the 12-step programs. So they have very much a sense of recovering many areas of their life. A recovery, firstly, and restoration of proper physical health, mental health. The social relationships were very important. Yeah. The idea that you need to come back to actually recognise that you are part of a group, and being able to moral recovery was also a very important part of it. The idea that you've transgressed, that there's been things that have happened that you lead to guilt and shame, and they need to be faced and worked through. Legal issues in many cases had to be resolved for people. There was the recovery of recognising there had been, for some of them, trauma that they were running away from that needed to be faced up to. And at the best of it, the recovery movement is a very high demonstration of the resiliency that people have, because you see people facing horrific circumstances as a group and trying to be able to restore humanity. And so then that becomes an important part of their growth. You did meet a lot of people who had sort of stories of spiritual recovery, where they actually had found God on their journey, and this is another part of what happens is that full return of the full humanity does involve some understanding of their spirituality, and so that journey becomes an important part of the full picture. So I became an enthusiast for the drug-free approach, and I went on to study Narcotics Anonymous in Victoria as another part of my journey of understanding the steps of what might be involved in recovery. And again, that was another very important part of my learnings. And again, a great privilege that people would share their stories, and I was able to learn a lot about how the 12-step programs work. As I moved forward in my journey, we became more and more interested in the idea that you could actually rally solutions and preventative solutions by working with families. And then that has led to being very interested in longitudinal studies as well, that help to paint the picture of how things go wrong in the development of children and young people, and what the risk factors are that lead to substance use, but also some of the protective factors that shield people. And so the stories start to join in, that you begin to see the full picture of healthy human development, where we have the potential to live very fulfilled lives. I began later in my career to sort of write about these in a framework of what's described as beneficial action. And suddenly you find that some of the things that had existed early in my career as a psychologist, where there was a very strict prohibition against talking about religion and spirituality, that these were not things to be studied and discussed within the realm of behavioural psychology, we began to be much more open in the current age with the breakthroughs in positive psychology. Now there's a great interest in actually studying what might be within the broad systems of theology, what might actually be some sort of areas that match with what we know about human development. And so practices such as you see within the 12-step movements and the moral recovery, where people do need to sort of admit that they had done wrong. So again, it fits with the idea that we are not perfect and that we are not God, was another one that came through very clearly in the narratives many people spoke about. But also forgiveness, that becomes something that's just so essential for people in their journeys. I think that as people begin to study what's working for them, we see that practices increasingly now in psychology that are seen to have evidence base of gratitude. And you begin to also see the role of understanding in the bigger picture of how we have, as a society, we have so many problems that come from living in ways that are just unhealthy. And you realise that
that's
the
interesting.
idea of having fallen from a healthier state is very clearly written large. And so we do see the idea that you've got to sort of take on and go to battle somewhat against those industries that would try and sell us away, that ways of making money in the alcohol, the tobacco, cannabis industries, false claims around opioids, all of these things become part of what I have studied in my career and come to understand as being things that are pulling us away from the possibility of fully flourishing and achieving a higher level of development.
Yeah, that's a word. I like the fully flourishing concept. And look, you brought up the M word, which we're going to talk about, but the A word. The M word's morality. And again, it's interesting, moral psychology, positive psychology, acknowledge those things. And what you're talking about, John, and we've looked at this before in our organisation, we trade out of this space aggressively as a not-for-profit public health education charity, is that we talk about things from an anthropological perspective. And what you're talking about is the supracultural. And it's interesting that, this year, AA celebrates its 90th birthday. Now, in the last 5 years, there's been some detractors starting to come up and posit their concerns about it, about how AA operates. And no one's here to say AA is the bulletproof best practice thing going around there. But it's incredibly valuable and incredibly useful and has done a lot of good because of the very factors that it engages with its 12 steps. And those 12 steps don't just tie into moral failings or moral capacities. They look at best practice for flourishing. And what we've seen, as I said before, that between uptake and exit of drug use, delay of uptake, what factors are missing prior to the uptake? And trauma is one thing you did mention, which is not a factor. We talk about, we're starting to do a paper on DOT. It's emissions, trauma, and D. I can't remember the D now. I knew that would happen. Deficits, that's the word. So in other words, what's missing? And of course, we now know from the 7 tabled ACEs, adverse child experiences, that are clearly written about and clearly fostered in the academic sector, that there's 7 of those in 3 different demographics, three different genres. And substance use is one of those, but that substance use affects the other 6. So when those deficits are, those ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, in place, substance use is in the mix, always in the mix. And so what is happening is we've got deficits, we've got emissions, and we've got trauma, and then we're sold a lie that we don't need to behave a certain way, we can do whatever, we can fix or feel better at any cost. And anthropology says, no, hang on, as a whole human being, there's a lot more going on in our existence. And the supra-cultural, and Seligman and even Jung, Carl Jung, and for those, we've talked about this before, but for those who haven't heard this, it's interesting. It's a true story. One of the gentlemen that was a catalyst for the starting of AA, not Dr. Bob or Bill Wilson, but there's another gentleman who was in the background, who was a chronic alcoholic who was seeing Jung as a therapist. And Jung had tried all these remedies and ideas, and nothing was working. And the statement he said to him, and I've got the documentation, saying, "Oh, you're hopeless. You're hopeless, mate." So he basically wrote this guy. He says, "What you need," this is Jung, "what you need," and I'm paraphrasing here, "is you need a spiritual encounter." He's put that. He says, "I've met people who have this thing with whatever it is they call it God, and it shifts them. It just shifts them." So he actually started down that path. That was a catalyst for him. Similar to you, your catalyst was seeing the harm and you wanted to prevent that. His was seeing an outcome and saying, well, let's look at this. And that was kind of one of the early starts of looking at the science behind the religious factors, because what we're talking about is what has historically helped us as a human species flourish, and what has been taken out of that flourishing space that's diminished us as a people, as a person. So it's reinstating that. And I think what we see today and what you're doing with SEED and with communities that care, you're bringing back in all those factors that are, that have been lost particularly in the last probably 20 or 30 years, last couple of generations, because of digital age, a whole bunch of factors we won't go into here. But what we're seeing now is an outcome of dysfunction and of brokenness and a self-medication that goes with that. Now, it's all been lumped into the trauma bucket. So everyone has trauma now, which I don't want to diminish trauma in anyone's life. But there is trauma, then there's omissions, and there are deficits. And we need to identify the different categories so we can effectively deal with them. But the emergence of, obviously, SEED, I want to get to SEED. I think that's really, really a remarkable space because it's quite unique, social and early emotional development. Now, we've just talked a little bit about that. So what sort of led you to really foster this? And how has this kind of contributed to the conversation around prevention?
Well, yes, SEED is a fantastic group of colleagues. It's very much the School of Psychology at Deakin University have gotten together and decided, all right, well, how can we collaborate and work together to look at what's known in the science of human development. My SEED leader, Professor Craig Olsen, has been a long-time friend and colleague, and he has very good-naturedly brought people together, and people are able to collaborate and work together. We're now the largest centre at Deakin. As I say, Deakin is rocketing in the international kingdom of research, and we have managed to bring together through SEED a very large group of longitudinal studies in the Asia Pacific that are all collaborating together. And so Craig has done a stellar job there. Myself, I collaborated with colleagues in the US, and we conducted a terrific longitudinal study called the International Youth Development Study.
Okay.
So all of this has given us insights into what happens as children grow up to promote these, as we say, the flourishing future, the very positive development, the positive youth development that's been another area that's really a growth in knowledge, that we begin to see the flourishing of character, of care, of competence, the things that really enrich our society, and where people are also increasingly able to make large connections, and they become very interested in looking out for the way in which our society might be able to be improved. And so they're very important connections. We also see the opposite, that where are the seeds sown for the fall into really lifelong pain and difficulties, problems, addictions, the anger, the anxiety, the mental health problems. So many people whose lives are, there is, you can actually begin to put a percentage on the different groups that you see. And so the norm, however, is not a healthy norm. What you realise is that many more people could, with the right conditions, be right up there in the flourishing. One of the things that I think Craig and myself and others identified very quickly is that the proper healthy way for a human to be is a caring role. And so this becomes very important. And this, you see this in a lot of the therapeutic community movement, and you also see it written in the 12-step programs quite well, that recovery involves the restoration of that human capacity to play a role. And this gives you meaning, it gives you mission, and it's suddenly you realise that this loving side that we have, where we actually reach out and we're less concerned about our own direction, but we're really focused on making sure others are going well, and we're playing a role there, is restorative of something about us, and begins to talk to our real nature, that this is actually where we see the recovery of this part of ourselves that once it's lost, we're in a great deal of misery and a great deal of pain. And so it's becoming clearer then how to sort of encourage cohorts of educational programs that might be able to take us in this direction of, I call it beneficial action, where programs actually have this ability to try and encourage the flourishing of the human heart as one side. Also, we need the flourishing of competence to be able to penetrate and understand what claims within the broad realm of noise we hear on social media, and we hear in the opinion realm, is actually speaking to us about things that really are likely to deliver real benefits. And so we need to be able to understand how to pick through the wheat from the chaff. And
exactly.
This is where
a lot of chaff out there, John. A lot of chaff.
That's right.
A lot of chaff.
So exactly. So it's very important. In my role at Deakin, I'm really honoured to be able to train students in the prevention sciences, and so more and more cohorts are able to call it for what it is when a policy is put to you as so-called harm minimising, when in fact you can see very clearly that it's going to breach social norms that could have protected children and young people from having to go into a life of so-called, experimentation with substance use. It's not at all inevitable. We note that from the international realm that countries differ greatly to the extent that they're able to shepherd children through those years so that they don't actually have to get involved in substance use. And they are the role models for the rest of the countries, that we need to actually set that as our targets, that more and more children and young people should be able to get through those years without having these side trips into the destructive effect of substances.
Absolutely.
And so it is that we live at a time when an ever-increasing number of children are growing up in families where parents are using substances. And so we're really, as you said at the beginning, and probably the reason for these podcasts is because we know we really have to take stock and begin to address this unnecessary harm that's all around us. And now we have some clear ideas, and we can see increasingly that prevention science programs begin to merge in with the idea that we need to bolster and strengthen the recovery programs. And so what emerges is the beginning of a picture of how at a population health level we could actually reduce the harm that's occurring at the population level due to substances and their sales and marketing.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think, look, we could spend a lot of time on this, John, and I know time is precious for you at the moment, and perhaps for another podcast. But what's been outlined there is very, very powerful, and I think it's almost brain-numbingly simple in one sense. But what we like to do is, particularly the bad actors in the sector, they like to complicate things. They like to throw in, alternative facts and post-truth nuances and cadences that determine that, sort of drug use is somehow all right. But we know from all the evidence, all of it that's in the marketplace, no matter how it's spun, substance use does harm to young people. It just does harm. No young person is benefiting from drug use, the substance use. And look, don't say, what about pharmaceuticals? We're not talking about those. Misuse of pharmaceuticals will do harm, of course. We're talking about illicit substances, tobacco, alcohol. The damage done to the developing brain is irrefutable, and whether it's small or large, and the impact it has on behavioural norms is clearly an issue. But what's interesting is that every behaviour, and I'm happy to be corrected by a behaviourist expert, every behaviour is learned in the human species. Therefore, it is taught, whether passively or aggressively. And again, we go back to the DOT model. It's deficit, omission, or trauma. What's actually being taught? What's actually being sewn into the kid's life, or missing from the kid's life, so the child stumbles into, or by default ends up involved in contagions that they are not equipped to manage. And I think this is where resiliency is such a powerful thing. And as you said, flourishing people are resilient people because they have an understanding of all the different facets that they have to engage with to actually call out something and set good boundaries and call out something that's actually dangerous. And the whole one of the biggest lies that the bad actors sow into the marketplace is you can't say no to drugs. I mean, it's a fascinating statement. No is one of the most powerful tools in your boundary setting flourishing toolkit, but the bad actors want to remove it. And it's interesting, we must say no to family violence. We must say no to drink driving. But if you're going to say yes to substances, you're going to say yes to those other two straight away. It's a bizarre cognitive dissonance that flourishes because it's been taught in the marketplace by certain actors. And the anthropological idea, and particularly the last 10 years, again, the anthropological idea of looking at the whole of person is really important. In the last 10 years, and your work aside, because I know that's been incredibly beneficial in informing policy and the public health policy, particularly with the National Drug Strategy, which has 3 primary pillars. Demand reduction is the first and primary pillar this time around, the last 10-year iteration, which is due to be redone next year. It'll be fascinating to watch who's going to be trying to sow into that space. But supply reduction, and then the bottom one is harm reduction, which we've always argued has got a place. It's helping keep drug users alive whilst they exit drug use. But harm reduction has now taken over harm minimisation and now interprets the policy through its own lens, and now harm reduction is primarily about drug use normalisation, which is tragic because a lot of genuine harm reductionists don't want people staying in drug use. They want them to exit drug use, but all the mechanisms are just normalising, trivialising, normalising. Then we have decriminalising, then we have legalising, which we won't go into today. However, what's interesting is that a paper that's recently been released, and one that's been in play for a while, and again, bringing back to the table what you've been talking about, which is really important, best practice for flourishing, best practice for public health and mental health well-being in society, was entered, again, finally published in the International Journal of Mental Health and Addiction. And the paper is called Prioritising Abstinence-Based, there's the A word, people, there's that A word, that dirty, horrible A word that we're not allowed to talk about, abstinence-based prevention, regulation and recovery to reduce substance-related harm and promote mental health at a population level. Each of those words in that title is important. I'll say it again. The paper published this month in the International Journal of Mental Health and Addiction is Prioritising Abstinence-Based Prevention, Regulation, Abstinence-Based Recovery to Reduce Substance-Related Harm and Promote Mental Health at a Population level. Now, tell our listeners a little bit about this imperative research, John, and some of the powerful salient aspects of it. What are some of the key? I mean, we want them to read it. We want them to spelunk it, drill into it and find out the data. But give us some salient points from that, John.
Yeah, well, as we started this topic, Shane, we're talking about, the lifetime journey that takes you through your discovery and your knowledge growth. But basically, this has really been the culmination of that, to be able to write this paper and to know actually that to write it with great confidence, which is really, I do believe this paper provides it'll provide a clear direction for drug policy for the next 10 years and will really shine a light for brighter futures internationally. So, listeners definitely read this, but also hear what I'm saying about just how absolutely important this is going to be for world policy. So the paper focuses on the experience that we've had in Australia, where we had a situation that before 2009, our alcohol policy really just had no prohibitions for children and young people using alcohol. There was no minimum age set. And at that stage, the mindset in Australia was that the Americans had it all wrong, that really there was no way that you would ever stop young people using drugs. And so many people would say to you, well, it's inevitable they're going to do it. And so we might as well just...
There's an instruction, there's a teaching episode.
A number of them get into trouble with it. So harm minimisation was, harm reduction was basically that. But the idea of young people not using alcohol was just seen to be an absolutely impossibility. So we would, at that stage, we're doing a lot of research, comparative, as I said, using longitudinal studies of cohorts growing up here in Australia and matched cohorts in the US. And it became apparent that a lot of the influences that the US prevention science colleagues had identified that were actually the factors that were being targeted in some of the successful efforts to reduce alcohol use in the US were actually exactly the same risk factors in Australia. There were no interactions showing that they're having a different effect. And so it became very clear that we just had it wrong. Our policies were just wrong. And so we studied the harm minimisation policies operating in Australian schools at that stage, and we found that they were associated with young people believing that their parents, their communities, that they all were actually having attitudes favourable to the young people using substances.
There's the modelling.
So this was leading to the young people having favourable attitudes.
Yep.
Yep. So, and as you know, Shane, favourable attitudes are a terrible thing because they're going to be very predictive of the behaviour that young people will then adopt.
It's a permission model. It's another word for it is permission model. It's a permission model. Do this. You're going to do it. It's going to happen. We're doing it. You're going to do it. It's part of the deal, It's taught and it's learned. Anyway, go on, John. Sorry. I'll go on my rant.
So we end up in a sort of a situation where it's an echo chamber and everybody has this pessimistic view that it just can't happen. Well, we took a different view, and our view of it was if it can happen in one place, that young people growing up a completely matched cohort are actually doing better than this cohort. And if we know what the risk factors are, then we can change them. And so we started to, first thing was to make people aware that it wasn't inevitable that young people would always use alcohol. And then the next thing was to realise parents were the primary areas that we need to focus on, and we need to encourage parents to change practice. And so it was that a big effort was made to help parents to sort of modify their rules around allowing, alcohol use at home. And then we had to also change the practice of retailers who were selling alcohol to young people. And then that required the guidelines to be altered so that they began to say somewhat firmly that young people should not be using alcohol. And they were a little bit limp in 2009. They've become even stronger now in 2020.
Correct.
So the Australian guidelines were then altered to make it clear to parents that the young ones should not be using alcohol, and gave all the reasons. And so that became clear that you can actually have campaigns that bring in sensible legislation. And then when we saw then the reduction in young people using alcohol in the school age period in Australia, we began to feel really confident that this is possible, prevention is possible, and it's all documented in this paper. What we then found was that as those young people grew up not using alcohol, they didn't start using alcohol when they reached the legal age. They actually wanted to keep going with that behaviour. And so we found that they've led to a generational change in Australia. We actually see now young adults with lower rates of alcohol use over the different years as new cohorts of young people come into the school age period. So the whole idea that this was inevitable and they would be then using some other substance hasn't been fulfilled. We're finding that they're actually, if they don't use alcohol, they're much less likely to experiment with other things. And so it is possible to live a very happy life where you're not using any substances. Yeah. And so the paper talks about what would need to change if we wanted to see these effects continue. We still have about double the rate of young people using alcohol in high school compared to the US. And it's not rocket science what they're doing in the US to reduce alcohol use. One of them is to have a age 21
Correct.
Legal drinking age.
That's right.
It can be done just with the Premier's approval. Tomorrow it could happen.
Yeah,
and if it did, we would see
maybe 10
massive
years ago,
reductions in young people using alcohol in the school age period.
Yeah.
And so these things we see as real possibilities, and we make them clear in this paper. And then so it goes that when you look at the recovery movement, we now see a Cochrane review that very clearly states that the 12-step approaches are really the superior ones when it comes to getting people off alcohol addiction, that they have really good economic returns. And so a Cochrane review is the very highest level of evidence you can get in a systematic review. And yet in Australia, our level of advocacy for these types of very effective programs is really low. Yeah. They have real difficulty cutting through the service environment in Australia.
The narrative in the sector, John. I want to just jump in on that one, because this population level, that dynamic in the paper is really important. We're not just talking about our individual use, and that's what the harm reductionists and the pro-drug activists, which are a separate group again, are really working hard to shift narrative, and they've worked hard the last few years. We saw with tobacco, and for those who aren't watching this space closely, Australian tobacco policy is one of the leaders in the world, because we went after this thing. We went after it with a policy. It was one focus, one message, one voice in the marketplace. No alternative voices. We've talked about this before. One message, one focus, one voice. Quit. Stop. End it. All the major sectors, health, education, government, media, all on board. So they taught the population that this is a bad idea. Now, we used to talk about smoking cannabis in high schools, going back 15 years ago, 10 years ago. We'd say, marijuana is more harmful than tobacco. And we get, 9 out of 10 kids stand up and say, yeah, absolutely. After the tobacco push, and the strong tobacco push, the reduction of tobacco usage in Australia to arguably the lowest in the world up until recently. And we asked the same question 10 years later, is marijuana more harmful than tobacco? And 90% of kids will stand up saying, no, tobacco is more harmful than marijuana, because the education's worked. At the same time, marijuana has been sold as a medicine. So again, there's a narrative going on here, John, and you mentioned that. I want to just touch on that without getting too provocative here. What do you think if demand reduction and prevention are the primary pillars of the national drug strategy, and as you've just said, we've seen it work in different areas, as we are seeing it work in recovery, abstinence-based prevention is an absolute success when it is properly engaged and fostered and developed. It doesn't always work, we understand that. What is it about the current, particularly illicit drug use with cannabis, and now we're trying to skip across illicit opioid use, such as heroin, or some of the other drugs, crystal meth. What is it about the narrative that seems to be blocking this best practice flourishing message? What is it in your mind that you can see as an academic? You may not see anything, you say, I just don't know, that's fine. But what is blocking this message? Why we got such a rabid support for normalising drug use, illicit drug use, and pushing back against prevention?
Well, I think that the first thing is that, again, it goes back to this attitude of pessimism that we see, that people just cannot believe that it would be possible that people could live their lives without using substances. And so that's the first thing, that the proof is there that actually we've seen national changes, and so that it's just wrong-headed to say that that's not possible. It is possible. Not only that, it's preferable.
Yeah.
Then I think that people argue that they're going to, if they once they have the idea that it's not possible, then what they're trying to do is obviously, save people from dying is one of the noble goals.
Noble goal,
many,
yeah, absolutely.
Many programs, and we totally support that.
Correct.
Except that the prevention model will save more lives.
Correct.
Not only that, it will reduce the period of suffering that people go through when they are involved in the addictions. And so we know that if you go back to the current models that are arguing we just can't stop it, that, we must legalise cannabis because we can't stop it. Again, as you said earlier, that's just stupidity. Yeah. I mean, are we going to do that with family violence? Yeah, we know we've got an epidemic of it. That doesn't mean we're just going to sit there and allow it.
We can't stop this. Sure. Legalise it. Take it off the books.
We would never do that. Yeah. So no, you're going to have to realise that some things, some parts of human progress do require a battle, and it's the battle of what's good and what's right over what's wrong. And so you cannot allow people knowingly, once you do know cause and effect for the effect of a substance. We know in evidence-based medicine that you would not give a poison to a patient. And so it is in public health that you cannot allow poison to be fed to the public. And so it is that we find ourselves in a fight here. So with medical cannabis, there has been absolutely no regulatory research to investigate any therapeutic benefits. It's been brought in through lobbying. And so it's now become incredibly popular, and people are being sold actually a poison and told that it's medicine. And this needs to be called out.
And the impact of that starting to be felt
with the punches, that it's inevitable that legalising recreational use will occur in Australia. Well, you know what? That's absolutely not something I'm going to roll over to. No. And so I'll be battling with that one, because there is absolutely every evidence that if you can avoid this type of legalisation, you're going to save lives, and you're going to save mental health, and you're going to save the health of children. And so these things matter a lot.
Generations, John.
Generational, yeah.
Absolutely.
So they're the things that I keep my eye on and I get excited about, and this paper spells it all out, which is terrific.
Now, John, awesome. Like I said, I know time's got away from us, and I really appreciate the conversation, the candor here. It's great. For those, again, who are listening to this, and we really do encourage you to this. It's not a kind of self-promoting thing, look at blah, blah, blah. It's a long time, this paper, and it was accepted and published by a very, very, very prominent journal. And they saw the value in it because it's coming to the fore again. We understand prevention is still better than cure. We understand the old adage is rolling over. This is the reality. Those who are in recovery wish they'd never started. We have a program at Deakin Institute called I Wish I Never. And it's not a negative, woe is me, shame, guilt-focused enterprise. It's people sharing their journeys of wish this had never happened to me. And if I knew this, I would not have. And if I had done this. So again, we want to equip, as do SEED and the communities of care, equip communities, Deakin University, equip communities with flourishing tools to help them flourish and grow and be the best human selves they can be. And children need these environments. And the CRC, Article 33 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, United Nations, is the only convention that actually mentions drug use, and not in a good way. And they acknowledge that children should be absolutely kept away from any drug-using environment. And therefore, in legalising or decriminalising mechanisms that liberalise drug use and say it's okay is exposing another generation to ongoing harms, unnecessary harms. John, just one last question before we go. Time is up. We ask this of 99% of our guests. The fence or the ambulance? The fence at the top of the cliff or the ambulance? Which one or both?
Well, you've heard me say very much where to invest would be in the fence. So that's where I put my career. It doesn't mean that you're against the proper use of an ambulance.
Perfect.
But it's absolutely going to be impossible if you think that the only answer is going to be just to forget the fence and only use the ambulance. So yeah, I absolutely believe in prevention, and I can see ways that we can get to a point where all of these things work together harmoniously in a community level. So recovery-based treatment works very well with the regulation of these harmful substance industries, and also a very strong emphasis on prevention. And this is the model to go with.
Brilliant. Good answer, John. Love it. And of course, we're on the same boat, so I love your answer. Confirmation bias has been stroked. I feel good. Professor John Toumbourou, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute joy. Hope to get you on again in the future. And for those for chiming in today, thank you again for being part of the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Until next time, be safe and flourish. See you then.
As we wrap up today's session, remember, each step towards understanding is a step away from unnecessary harm. We're here to empower, inspire, and pave the way for optimal well-being. Stay resilient, stay informed, and continue being the change your community needs. Thank you for joining us at the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Until next time, take care and keep pushing forward.